comment. Yeah, I'm Chinese, and I come from Beijing, a city which was looted twice by British colonialism in the 19th century. And unfortunately, I noticed that in the modern world, there's this historical amnesia and even romanticizing of British colonialism. For instance, the recent Hong Kong protests, you have people that flying the butcher's apron, the British colonial flag, as if it's a symbol of progressivism by people who are born long after the handover, and they don't realize that even back in the British colonial days, the British governor was directly appointed by the UK government, and they have the exclusive little enclave in which no Chinese is allowed. So yes, and one of the Canadian newspapers I saw even made a case that saying progressive is beneficial and good for Hong Kong, and that they should be allowed to romanticize it. So I just want to say that there's important work to oppose the Ramsey Centre and makes people realize the truth about history.
Thank you very much. Okay.
I mean, everything militates against people realising the truth about history, Richard. The way our culture is set up is such that it stacks the balances, stacks the weights against people who want to develop some kind of independent, politicised view of the way that things are in this world. It's a world disfigured by exploitation, by environmental destruction, by the ugliest forms of discrimination and hatred. But, you know, we're brutalised by the mass entertainment industry, the mass media, by the sheer need to work exhausting jobs, which drain us often body and soul and just rob us of the energy that we need and the time to develop a coherent reflection on the way that the world actually is. And our political lords and masters are very happy with things being exactly that way. That's why they cut penalty rates, for example. That's why they're into the degradation of public services, as we've just seen, as a consequence of the most recent federal budget. Everything conspires to prevent people adopting the kind of critical perspective on our world that I think is absolutely necessary if our societies are to survive the impending environmental catastrophe that's bearing down on us. So I think you're absolutely right to deplore the historical amnesia, and I would add that it's not just historical amnesia, it's also a lack of a political sensibility. Everything conspires to depoliticise us. And that has only one consequence, of course, which is the reinforcement of the status quo.
Okay, well, I'm going to round this up because almost all the topics that are listed on the pink sheet of paper for the rest of the season are a test of the claims about Western civilization. Take, for example, the topic that occurs in 4 weeks' time, Julian Assange, an alliance to resist the United States culture of revenge. Or the question that follows about Australia's political hostages as scapegoats, the dreadful containment of people on Manus and Nauru. So in a way we will continue that conversation. The topic that's somehow missed out on the pink sheet, which is in 2 weeks' time, is about housing affordability. So there is a topic, and we're working every 2 weeks now in the top step. In 2 weeks' time, it's about housing affordability, but in 4 weeks' time, Mary Costa-Keys, the former newsreader with SBS, and Mark Davis, a pretty brave and distinguished journalist with the ABC and SBS, will be talking about how to resist the United States culture of revenge. I mean, if ever there's a contemporary test of what humanity means, let alone Western civilization, it's about the Assange, in a way, the treatment of Assange, the attempt by a naked power to somehow concoct the idea of 175 years in prison for telling the truth, is in a way a kind of neat postscript to my gratitude to two great speakers and two wonderful pieces of presentation this evening.
So when's the next Politics in the Button? 2 weeks?
It's always 2 weeks, yeah.
So what's the date?
But there's no more in the stuff. Not next Thursday, but the Thursday.
Yeah,
after.
the 25th. The 25th. But the first session in August is August the 8th. So it's now every 2 weeks in the Toxteth, starting at 6:30.
I certainly hope to get a response to it. I had never heard of Ramsey until this moment, and I'm awfully glad that I had never heard of Ramsey until this moment, because it sounds absolutely bloody awful. But I'm sort of from the angle of something called Western tradition being capable of self-criticism and capable of respecting things that are not Western tradition, and B, actually it's a sort of branch of Middle Eastern tradition. After all, we worship a bloke with long hair who said things like, the meek shall inherit the earth, and C, I guess an egalitarian tradition going back to Moses. I'll leave it at that. There are these elements in the Western tradition that emphatically do not substantiate a radical right agenda such as that of Ramsey. Do please comment,
Do you want to go?
even if it doesn't sound like it.
No. Well, if there are two main questions at the end, we'll take it together. But do you want to have a go at this one?
I think how you framed it in terms of like it should be able to sustain critique is really crucial. Any institution, any course, any sort of representation of knowledge at a tertiary institution should be structured in such a way to encourage critical engagement, as opposed to just sort of mimetic representation in students. It's unfortunately the way that they're proposing for the teaching of this is not structured at all towards critique or towards any sort of form of critical rigour that you'd expect in every other discipline. But one of the sort of the sad things is that you better hope that you got paid to study at the Ramsey Centre, because you certainly wouldn't get an education and you wouldn't get any transferable skills. It would essentially be roughly the equivalent of you sort of like memorising a few great books. So I think a critically engaged, as many institutions are already presenting, there's many courses at the University of Sydney in which you can critically engage with these ideas. I think critically engaged sort of even texts on Western civilization, such as a great book structure, could be done effectively and with, collaboration and with rigour outside of the institution even. It's just that's not what they're proposing. I think that's just what happens when these ideas are presented by people who aren't actually academics and who are not really interested or very engaged with education and the things that educators do.
I mean, the head of the Ramsey Centre, Simon Haynes, has been very explicit that he thinks that undergraduate students in universities have just heard too much about the crimes of colonialism and sexism and racism, and that it's time to swing the pendulum back in the other direction. So he explicitly repudiates exactly the kind of self-critical stance that you're rightly, I think, identifying as something that we value in the intellectual tradition that we have, been acculturated in. Because no one denies that there is a particular historical tradition which has shaped the way that questions of undergraduate education have been determined in society so far. I mean, the reason that the undergraduate curriculum in the humanities is what it is there are historical reasons for that, and we are shaped by that tradition. That tradition is already interrogated and perpetuated and taught in Australian universities. If Ramsey had wanted to support that insufficiently critical, I think, but nevertheless critical in intent kind of teaching, he could have just donated money to existing arts faculties. He chose not to do that. He chose to make this sort of shock humanitarian intervention into arts faculties by setting up this centre, which was precisely directed against the people who currently do the work in universities, out of the belief that they're stuffing it up, they've become blinkered and,
Welcome to the Toscas Hotel on this fine Thursday evening for the local badge draw.
they've become, blinkered and obsessed by the various kinds of dogmatism and doctrinaire thought that the Ramsay Centre are there to try and undo.
Have you got a loud voice? Okay.
Yes, I think everybody spoke so well. I hope everyone can hear me over the chalk raffle or whatever it is. I think what we have to acknowledge is that universities have become corporations, and they're obviously very easily corrupted with this handful of money being offered to them, and they'll do anything to just keep the corporation growing. And we're facing a situation where young people these days are not challenged to critical thinking with critical thinking. I work as a teacher, and I'm coming across the most shocking example of ignorance among young teachers who know nothing about anything except how they can get through their courses as quickly as possible and read as little as possible and download all the prepared lessons off the internet, so there's no challenge to any thinking there. And Ramsay was such an extremely wealthy man that he had a lot of acolytes, hanging around, ready to get some of the money. And I think he was actually, I know him through personal friends, but I think he was very, probably a soft touch in a way. So his mates who were very wealthy, Liberal Party friends would be obviously there, ready to siphon some of that money off. His will was obvious. He gave $4 million to his gardener. He had a lot of money to spare. And I think it's been siphoned off into this sort of setup. And I think Ramsay was constructively involved in deciding for it to be a pro-Western civilisation, ruling everything else. I'm going to ask a question. So I just want to know how, at Sydney Uni, what courses are being offered in Indigenous studies in the arts degree area. You said something's been closed down. I wasn't quite sure what that was. I think we need to really set high standards in it for self-critical thinking, not allow young students to go through just miming whenever they get off the internet, So obviously, is there a voice still that's challenging this Ramsay thing at Sydney Uni? I think in Wollongong it's gone through, hasn't it?
It's still as if there's
So I'll just ask my two questions and I'll stop. So Wollongong, is it actually a foregone conclusion? Sydney Uni, is there still a strong opposition and suggesting it should be a more balanced approach? I think the comparative idea has to go through where every course in Western civilisation has to have the balanced approach, looking at documents from other civilisations, obviously are the first people here. So can you just tell me whether that's there's still a strong voice at Sydney Uni that's likely to stop this thing going through from the Ramsay Centre?
You might want to
You
talk
want
about
to start first?
Well, the question's to you.
Yeah, you take
Well,
it.
I'll hand it over to Nick to just talk about what level of organising there is at the University of Sydney at the moment through, different collectives and such in a second. But so just in terms of what I was talking about, the closure of the Koori Centre, so that was a centre that had a combination of student support services as well as academic courses. Around about 2012, a lot of universities, Macquarie, Wollongong, Western Sydney Uni, were hit by some funding changes that meant that most either sort of closed down these services or they split them up and then the services were subsumed into regular student services. I think UTS is probably the only organisation that actually took the opportunity to reinvest in their Aboriginal services, both at a research level and at student support. So while a couple of years ago we did have a really good range of courses that were a part of a department. Now what we have is a major, which is predominantly being run with staff from the education department. I myself, technically I'm from English because we don't actually have postgraduate studies in Indigenous studies at present. So while technically you can get a major in Indigenous studies at the moment through units, we've got introduction to culture, introduction to history, a handful of language units, which is really exciting. And then I recently lectured in land and culture. So we have some units, we don't have anywhere near as much as we would like, and we don't have the sort of structuring there with resources, networks that can build up or effectively build up like a strong body of Indigenous representation across different departments, let alone within our own major. So we get some enrolments, not as many as you'd like, but we get occasionally people, education students predominantly, who would like to take the opportunity to learn a little bit about Indigenous culture. But the reality is that what we actually do in that major is really all of the critical thinking skills that we hope that students can take to other courses. So I literally teach students how to write a sentence here. It's very critically motivated work. We have a unit on research methodologies. We're not necessarily out there teaching students the content of Aboriginal culture and distilling it that way. We're actually really trying to equip them with the critical thinking skills so that they can see Aboriginal representation in the society that they're living in. And the thing is that Ramsay Centre will never sit down and talk with people like myself or other staff from the Indigenous Studies major to see the way that we're doing things and how we are critically equipping students with those skills. We'll never get that opportunity to have that conversation because we're perceived as being part of like a leftist enemy or some sort of ghost to settler colonial present. So it's just really disheartening that we take on so much of the burden of critical thinking in Indigenous studies because we know that we need to equip these students with those skills if they're going to ever be able to engage properly and ethically with Aboriginal representation. And then, we never get the credit for that. We're very intellectually involved and we never really get the credit for that in the work that we're doing, and we don't get the funding and the support behind that. And I'd like to see that change. I just don't know what future we have in store for that. But in terms of the Ramsay Centre specifically, I might just pass over to you.
Is that Sydney or Wollongong?
Sydney. Yeah.
There's strong contestation against the Ramsay Centre at Sydney University. When the deal was first mooted, over 200 members of the arts faculty wrote a much publicised, actually, open letter denouncing it as Western supremacism writ large. Over 15 departments have collectively voted that they oppose any arrangement with the Ramsay Centre. There is a staff group called Staff Against the Ramsay Centre, which organises events and leaflets students, and so there's very strong contestation at Sydney University. The problem is, of course, that universities these days are, bureaucracies where the opinions of academics don't matter very much anymore. So that's, having academic opposition is a necessary but not sufficient condition for actually getting the results that we want. One just very quick other observation. I think we need to acknowledge that universities have never really been intended to foster critical thinking. Now that may be a scandalous thing to say. It's true that there's a certain range of critical thinking which is fostered and encouraged in universities. On the other hand, university staff are mainly middle-class professionals, and we do not graduate social revolutionaries. We graduate, on the whole, compliant members of the next generation of workers exploited and exploited and exploiters. Universities are part of the mechanism of social reproduction that a society like ours needs in order to, keep capitalism on its legs. Universities are fundamentally not about social critique, I think, but about conformity, unfortunately. Shall I?
Yeah. I just want to add a little bit of history, because the survival of the radical philosophy department, political economy and sociology, social work and social policy, occurred in the 70s and 80s because of massive student revolts. And a Vice-Chancellor, Sir Bruce Williams, once said to me, "I see you're making progress." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Your students have stopped camping on my lawn." Anyway, that's just a little bit of history. Kieran, your question.
Yeah.
But make it short.
I'll try and make it short.
You'll try and make it short.
Yeah, okay. Do you agree that, thank you for your talk, do you agree that the Ramsay Centre is a cultural, for want of a better word, troll that aims to develop right-wing ideologues, bypassing the university's traditional democratic structures and creating an elite curriculum and coursework? Isn't this the subjection of universities to big money and their continual financialisation, commodification, corporatisation, loss of intellectual critical rigour and independence in favour of right-wing, old-style cultural war propaganda? Isn't this the ultimate threat to civilisation, the ultimate barbarism? And I'm reminded of a comment made by Mahatma Gandhi when he was questioned about the virtues of Western civilisation. He thought for a moment, and then he replied, "Western civilisation. I think it would be a good idea."
What's going to go back? Do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I think that it's a structure potentially in the way of, or that's prohibiting us from properly talking about and engaging with the greatest threats that we have to the world today, issues of climate change and impending nuclear war. So it maintains, instigates, and projects those structures that mean that we can't necessarily engage with the greatest threats that we have to society. But apart from that, solid, good analysis.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The greatest threats to Western civilization are complete environmental collapse. And I think, there's a risk that we have when we enter into this debate about the Ramsay Centre and higher education and ideology, that it serves as a distraction from what, on any, I think, reckoning, have to be considered the most important and acute political crises in Australian society, which have nothing to do with universities, but everything to do with the environment, with the very real racism and exploitation faced by Indigenous people, with the ongoing and increasingly brutal class war being waged by, the property-owning classes, the capitalist classes, business elites, corporations against working people. These are the real battles of Australian society. The Ramsay Centre plays a role in all of that, but it's by no means the most urgent frontline of progressive struggle in Australia, I would say.
Stephen, you've got a question?
Sort of a question, yeah. I'll try not to do a rant. I'm good at rants, thanks. Yes. Oh, well, things come to mind that I read somewhere in Chomsky talking about a European plague, and that's, I think, what we have actually. I mean, we're all sitting around, it's all very civilized, but if you look at what we're doing, it's as you said, it's something like this. It's a fouling of our own nest. No other civilization has actually done that. Destroyed the substructure of what we're doing. Whatever else you can say about it, I don't think you can. It's just exemplified by the collapse of the Barker, the Murray-Darling River system. It's shocking. And then you have Four Corners, not even mentioning the people who actually live along the river for some reason. In NAIDOC week, they don't. But anyway, this isn't sort of. I don't want to go into self-flagellation because we all live in this, what seems to be a Western civilization. But I was interested because my father was a refugee from the Third Reich, and you have some background. Was there something like this happening in Nazi Germany, with, like, say, degrees in Germanic civilization and that sort of thing? Is there some direct parallel to this that happened then? Because I don't know, but I would guess that there probably is. And if anyone knows about it, I'd love to hear it. And, no? But there were special, like the medical faculties in Nazi Germany had special phenomenology, and they were all racialized. The medical degrees were. So this, it carried into the, into academic life. What's that?
An awful lot of academics got carted up.
Yes, but I'm sure they also changed. I don't know. I'm just a speculator. I've never read about this, but it must only bits and pieces. But the main thing is how do we actually stop it? How do we radicalise? I believe in New Zealand, it's the job of the universities to critique the societies in which they are. It's actually their job, partly. Whether they live up to it, I don't know. But apparently in New Zealand that's the case. The main thing is how can we stop it? And I think I'd like to praise one book, I don't know if everyone agree with this, which is Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, which, okay, it takes sort of this European thing at its own values, which, look, if everyone was hunter-gatherer in Australia, all the nations were that, when Europeans arrived, that would be absolutely fine. It so happens that Bruce Pascoe is telling a different story, so that even by these strange values, if you just notice, when people arrive by boat to Australia as refugees seeking asylum, it's never a boat. They never arrive on a boat. It's always a leaky boat. It's always a rickety boat. Why can't they just arrive on a bloody boat? It's irrelevant if it leaks, or if it's rickety, or if it's unseaworthy. It's a boat. But that's the thing. If they arrive on a rickety boat or an unseaworthy boat, they're not decent people. And it's the same thing with indigenous people here. If they didn't indulge in agriculture, then there's something wrong. And it's the same sort of, it's like the materialistic way of looking at people. But anyway, the main thing is how do we get rid of it? How do we get rid of it? How can we all do something to get rid of it, this infection?
I do want to really quickly answer that thing, to speak to that thing about agriculture. Some of my family are connected to the Brewarrina, which has the fish traps that are the oldest sort of man-made. We don't believe that they were made by man, we believe that it was made by Miami. Man-made agricultural structure or any sort of structure in the world. I think what's crucial about that, and you have raised an appropriate suspicion about the necessity of justifying Aboriginal culture on terms that are more structured around what the West sees as necessary. But it is, nonetheless, it's enormously true that we had very, very involved curatorial practices with our land. The land determines your identity, your kinship, your relationships to everything. But it is really crucial to make that argumentation, not simply to say, look at us, we've got the same things that you have, but because the very foundation of the Declaration of Terra Nullius, which never actually existed, there's no legal, Terra Nullius was never actually declared. The assumption of it rests on Locke's sort of, labour theory of property, and it was a misconception about our participation in the landscape that is at the centre of why we are experiencing ecological collapse in the Australian environment. So that kind of work that Bruce Pascoe was doing, while you can take the perspective of it that it's serving the sort of a Western kind of perception of that, it's also what we need now. And regardless of the politics of it, this, you mentioned the Murray-Darling, like that river is dying and we need to take a participatory role in that, and works like Dark Emu help in that process.
Yes, absolutely. Two little comments. And I can speak mainly about my own discipline, linguistics, Stephen, because you asked, was there a Ramsay Centre in the Nazi period? There didn't need to be. There didn't need to be, because racial science had all of these ramifications in the established disciplines that were taught in universities in Germany in the 20s and 30s. There have been studies of this for my discipline, linguistics, if you're interested, there's a great book by Chris Hutton called Linguistics and the Third Reich, I think, which maps the way in which even an apparently objective and innocent discipline like linguistics was shot through with the premises of an essentially fascist worldview. And this brings out a very important point, I think, which is that knowledge is political. Ramsay supporters often take on this tone of injured pride when their noses are rubbed in the fact that they're serving these noxious ideological purposes, and they try to protest that they're just looking they're just studying texts. They're just reading and learning about poetry or political science or history or philosophy or whatever it might be, as though that enterprise was not something that was intrinsically bound up with political questions. Knowledge is political. There's no way that we can pretend it isn't. And the question then becomes which side you're on. On the very important question of how we fight this, I would say two things. First, we decide what side we're on. We don't pretend that we're not on any side, as so many academics particularly do. That's a posture which only reinforces the status quo. And so once we decide what side we're on, we then organise. Because we're not going to do anything individually. We can only make progress collectively, as you well know, obviously. But they're the two things that I think that need to be emphasised. We are responsible for the way our society goes. We can't just opt out of it and throw up our hands and say, this doesn't concern me. Not taking a side is tantamount to accepting the current state of the world and its direction. We have no choice but to fight that. We have to take a side, but what we do ourselves doesn't really matter anywhere near as much as the ways in which we organise and collaborate collectively and democratically with other people for the kinds of changes that we collectively decide need to happen.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question. Okay, this gentleman here.